Okay, so now let's see these principles in action. So let's set the scene. So we're on product.com, we're on the projects page, and we're in the active projects. The most important action that you would take would be creating a new project. You can see from this interface, everything's kind of jammed up together. There's not a lot of visual differentiation. I can't really tell what's important. In fact, if I blur my eyes a little bit and I kind of try to tell what's the most important, it looks like the question mark on the top right corner, which is not great. So we're going to go through 9 steps, and we're going to see how this interface can go from this state into a state that has really good visual hierarchy. So our first step is to separate the navigation from the content area. So that already made a huge improvement, and what we did was we just introduced white space there. The next thing that we want to do is make sure that our navigation is really solid. So we're going to split that navigation into 2 levels to actually depict the hierarchy of the system, which is our primary and secondary navigation. All right, so now we have our projects timeline admin and new project at the very top with our logged in state. Alan Turing is the person that is logged in. And then we have our question mark over in the corner. But we can see that active and archived, they're kind of just hanging there in the abyss. They don't really have a container around them or anything to kind of center or ground them. So the next step we're going to do is to introduce boundaries around the navigation. Okay, so there we go. So now we have active being obviously selected. We've also introduced the interaction color there. So we can tell with this blue color that this is something you can interact with. So the next thing that we're going to do is focus on the content area for a minute. And we're going to distinguish the table header row from the rest of the contents. So we're really just starting with like the most basic thing we could do, which is just a black stroke. But when you think about it and look at it in terms of visual hierarchy, you can see that that black stroke is really strong and my eye is really getting pulled towards that black stroke. So now we're just going to kind of ease off of it a little bit. So you can see that kind of rebalances the page. So now I can tell that the header row is different, but it's not pulling my eyeball towards it. The next thing that we want to do is clarify that main action. It's very key to this whole screen, and yet it's really de-emphasized. It just kind of looks like a navigation item right now. So we turn that new project label, it's now in a button, and it's very noticeable on the screen. So the next thing we want to do is delineate the table rows. So again, we start with the most basic element that we can, which is the black stroke. But you might be feeling a little bit sick to your stomach right now as you see how intense this black stroke is, which means that you're learning visual hierarchy. So now let's go through and really nuance these table rows because they're really, really important. This is the main content area. This is the main kind of part of the page. First thing we're going to do is take these sort of jammed up rows and give them a little bit of space, little room to breathe. All right. Now, instead of this dark stroke, we're going to use a stroke alternative. So we're still going to maintain a delineation or separation between the components, but we're just going to ease off a little bit. So we just do a white background instead. They do feel a little close together still, and they're not really obviously separated. So we kind of lightened up that treatment of the stroke, but now we need to kind of make things visually more separate from each other. So we increase the vertical spacing there and give everything a little bit more room to breathe. The final step for our rows is that we want to give them a little bit more contrast to the background. So we're doing a white fill on a bit of a grayish background. And so what we're going to do is do something a little bit more subtle, and we'll introduce a shadow here. So that just increases that visual differentiation between the rows. It's a little bit more subtle. Now we're going to draw our attention to typography in the interface. So what we want to do is we want to introduce a little bit of differentiation between the things that are coming from the system and the things that are more user-generated. So for example, what we're going to do is we're going to change the header row again, and we're going to make them all caps, as well as the new project button. It's just a bit of a subtle change that will differentiate between these things compared to the rest of the screen. Great. Okay, so now we have our caps. So we've increased the visual hierarchy of our table rows, and so now they're pretty prominent. But when users actually will go through an interface like this, they'll kind of memorize these header rows pretty quickly, and then want to really focus on the actual content in the table. So what we're going to do is we're going to ease off a little bit visually. And all we've done is just change that dark color of the type to like a medium or dark gray. Then what we want to do is optimize the table scanning itself. So if you look at the table, things are pretty blending across, and we have the opportunity to make visual scanning a lot easier. So the first thing that we're going to focus on is the status. And so basically we're going to introduce a bit of a visual treatment for the status to make it more scannable. So here we created lozenges around each of these statuses. And so people can easily scan and see what status is what. And they can differentiate this column of being about something else than the other information in the table. The other thing we want to do to increase our table scanning is to give a bit of another visual cue. If you draw your attention to the attachments column, you can see that we have a whole bunch of numbers with this label of attached files. But actually in this case, we have the opportunity to put an icon in here because there's a really familiar icon for files. So it's not doable in every case, but it is kind of a nice thing to increase that scannability with a familiar icon that's pretty intuitive. So we're going to put a file icon in there. Now you'll notice that we've also introduced more visual elements, so it's maybe a little bit more busy. But we have this label that's actually repeated a whole bunch of times, attached files. So we're going to simplify the interface by now removing that label. So now what we're going to do is rebalance our spacing because we now have a big gap on the right. Ah, that looks better. And then finally, our last step is to really kind of elevate this interface and make it look polished. And what we're going to do is we're going to introduce the color palette. So take a look at this screen now and see what difference it makes to have a color palette applied. So these were all of our 9 steps that we took to really build up this interface from basically having 0 visual hierarchy to having a balanced visual hierarchy. So we used basically all of the different tools in our visual hierarchy toolbox to achieve this. This is a side-by-side view of our 0 visual hierarchy to our good visual hierarchy.